Protesters in Iran sentenced to death, with 5 executions ordered and thousands still held in detention. Much of the world is outraged by Iran's brutal crackdown on demonstrators. But will their continuing bravery lead to any change? Also on the program, 8 billion others. The global population reached a new milestone on Tuesday, but how many humans can our planet sustain? I'm Andrea Sankey, and this is the Newsmakers. Well, 5 people have been sentenced to death in Iran. It comes as the country's biggest protests in recent years enter a 3rd month, sparked by the death of 22-year-old Mahsa Amini after she was arrested by police. The demonstrations soon turned into a revolt against the Islamic Republic itself. As protests continue, the government has ramped up its response. According to the Human Rights News Agency, at least 362 protesters have been killed and more than 16,000 are in detention. Earlier this month, a majority of Iranian lawmakers called on the judiciary to show no leniency against protesters. So far, 5 people have been handed death sentences, but many fear more will follow over charges of corruption on earth and war against God. Well, those sentences have garnered international condemnation.
The Islamic Republic has used the death penalty to uphold the barrier of fear for 43 years. The current protests have seen the collapse of that barrier, which the Iranian authorities now attempting to rebuild with current repression and death sentences.
So to further explore what's happening in Iran, I'm joined from Washington by Shahriar Ahy. He's a senior advisor to the pro-democracy group Iran Transition Council. Thank you so much for being with us. Let's begin then with these death sentences. There have been some exaggerated numbers about just how many people have been sentenced out of these protests. At one point, I think 15,000 was being thrown around. That was way off, but still, the government says 5 have been sentenced to death. Tell us what effect even that has on those demonstrators on the streets now in Iran.
Well, it hasn't had any effect so far. Obviously, there's a war going on between the Iranian people and the regime. The ultimate weapon of the regime is fear, and that's the sole reason for these death sentences. The 227 deputies in the parliament, Majlis, who have actually asked the judiciary for these death sentences, are sandwiched between 2 fears. One fear of the people, of the consequences of their action, and the other fear of the wrath of the regime itself against themselves by siding with the people. So obviously the international community is trying to make one of these fears heavier. And you have seen a statement from Human Rights Commission or members of the Human Rights Commission. There is a meeting on the 24th of November in Geneva, where the Human Rights Commission of the United Nations will sit to see whether there's enough cause to convene an investigative committee.
Okay.
Now, that would shed a light on everyone responsible for these deaths in Iran, whether it's on the streets or by execution or whatever.
Right.
And hopefully that would increase the fear of partaking in these atrocities.
Okay. Yeah, we'll have to see how that investigation develops. But in the meantime, do you think we'll see more death sentences actually handed down? I mean, how quickly are they decided?
Well, it's like a Stalinist judiciary. Obviously, they're trying to increase the fear, but they themselves are caught between the vice, if you speak, of the wrath of the people on the streets. So there are questions being raised by enough influential people, even within the regime, about
Right.
the extent to which they can show this cruelty.
Can you help us understand, give us any idea of how many Iranians actually do agree with what the government is doing? I mean, there are still the true believers in the Islamic Revolution. They're determined to protect it really at any cost. How numerous are they really? And will they be able to maintain their grip?
Right. It's a very good question. You've got to look at this young generation. There's a generation that has been brought up on the internet, sees pictures of the normal world, where people live normal lives. And they contrast it with the Dark Ages rule of the faces, of the character, of the worldview of the rulers. And they say, we don't want that.
Mm.
And obviously, these are the ones that are driving this revolution. Their parents belong to a generation of despair that gave up hope. They said, well, this is our destiny. What can we do? And
Okay.
in every family in Iran, this is going on right
Mm.
now, this debate between the children and the parents. And I think the driving force would be international support and seeing a vision, a clear vision for a way out, for a future.
Okay.
Eventually, it's this generation that's going to win. There's no question about it.
I'm sure they'd be pleased to hear your optimism because there's still some questioning if this is a revolution or just massive protests. Very quickly, which one is it?
Well, the French President Macron called it a revolution, and you know how big a word revolution is for the French.
Okay. I'll tell you what, that's unfortunately all the time we have. Shahriar Ahy, I'd like to thank you so much for being with us on the Newsmakers. Greatly appreciate
My
it.
pleasure.
Now, on Tuesday, our global population hit an alarming 8 billion people. And 15 years from now, the United Nations says we'll be living with 9 billion other human beings. Well, just since we started this program today, around 2,000 more people have joined us on the planet. Here's a closer look now at our population growth and where it's going.
Along with the advancements of the Industrial Revolution came the world's first billion people. And just over a century later, that number doubled. Medical advancements brought higher life expectancy and lower death rates. By the 60s, we started to see more rapid population growth, with the world hitting 3 billion. And just over 20 years later, another 2 billion people were added. 6 billion waved in a new millennium. And only 22 years later, we now have over 8 billion fellow human beings on the planet. And it's not slowing down. The UN says that our planet is on course to reach 9 billion by 2050, with most of these people being born in sub-Saharan Africa.
So how many people can the planet really handle? As leaders meet at COP27, there appears to be a lack of will to acknowledge a connection between population growth and climate change. But can we afford to ignore it and sustainably adapt to our ever-growing number of people? Well, remember, nature provides us with most of the materials we need to survive, from water, food, and air to the raw materials we need to make much of our clothing and medicine. But we are consuming and polluting those resources very quickly. Right now, 1 million plant and animal species are threatened with extinction, and we're losing forest areas the size of 27 football fields every minute. As the population grows, we take more from our land and seas. So should leaders be exploring humane ways to control population growth, perhaps via contraception? According to the UN Population Fund, half of global pregnancies are unplanned, and 257 million women have an unmet need for safe contraception.
Girls and women are very vulnerable when it comes to climate change disasters. And as you mentioned, Malala Fund has estimated that this year climate-related events could prevent up to 4 million girls from lower income countries in completing their educations. So girls are the victims, girls are affected by these climate change disasters. But also when we educate girls, when we provide them with quality education, with climate education, they can become farmers, conservationists, solar technicians, and they can fill other green jobs as well. And critical thinking and problem solving skills can then allow them to help their communities to adapt to climate change and how to tackle the issues of climate change. Also, when girls are educated and when they stay in schools, they get married later in their lives, and then they have less children, and that also helps us to reduce the impacts of climate change that the population increase brings.
So, as Malala has acknowledged, our population continues to grow, but our planet does not. So, can we really sustain billions more human lives? Joining me now to debate that are from Bristol in the UK, Robin Maynard. He is the director of Population Matters. And from London, Max Lawson. He's the head of Inequality Policy and Advocacy at Oxfam International. Robin, let me start with you. You know, we're the only species on the planet that has really engineered our way out of every natural population control mechanism. The agricultural revolution meant we could adapt our way out of any food shortages. Advances in medicine and vaccines mean multiple times fewer people die in a pandemic or from disease. It is miraculous what humanity has been able to do to save lives, but is it sustainable?
Well, it's certainly miraculous, and it's really positive as well, because it means, millions of children are not dying in infancy, and people are living longer, healthier, and in some cases, wealthier lives. So that's really good. And here at Population Matters, we never talk about population control. We don't want to control anybody. The only thing we want to control, really, is the excessive consumption of some of the wealthiest people in the world who are probably doing the most damage. But it is a fact that our population is also a driver of climate change. That's there in black and white in the International Panel on Climate Change latest report, the IPCC report, where they talk about growth in GDP and growth in population. The two together are drivers of both our climate crises and our ecological crises. And the great news about both of them is they're solvable, but it's very hard to get people to consume less, particularly when they're enjoying a high standard of living. We need to have fairer shares, and I'm sure my colleague from Oxfam will agree with that. But we also have the technology, i.e. family planning, contraception, the pill, to enable women to choose smaller families, which overall, that's what people want. They want to be able to control their own fertility and choose how many children they have and when. And that isn't the case for nearly 270 million women in the world. So if we could enable that, we could also enable all girls to stay in education for 12 years, we would see a smaller population, a more equitable population, and people's life opportunities improving. And it would take the heat off the planet. It's in the top 5 solutions of cutting carbon dioxide emissions, more impactful than all wind power onshore and offshore.
But even with, population controls of some sort, like easy access to contraception, for example, the population is still going to be growing. How much can our planet realistically sustain?
Yeah, it is going to be growing, and that's the UN's latest projections. It's sort of their middle range, as they say, which is sort of 95% certainty, is 9.7 billion people by 2050, maybe 10.4 peaking at 2086, could go up to 11 billion by 2100. But there's another graph they have produced, a forecast, where they're looking at what could be the case in 2100. It's a very strange figure. It says, if the number of children on average per woman across the world went up by half a child or down by half a child, or more sort of logically, think of one child more or less every second family, we would either peak at 15 billion people on the planet, i.e. rather a lot more than we currently are at 8 billion, or at 7.3 billion, which is fewer than we currently are.
Okay.
And there's very few people who wouldn't agree that heading for that 7.3 billion target voluntarily, without any coercion, wouldn't be better for people and planet.
Okay, but looks like we're going to get there anyway. And, Max, our climate change policy today also centers around saving more lives. So again, we seem to be kind of engineering our way out of any climate change-induced population controls, which, as Robin said, is great. We're saving lives. But I'll ask you again, is this truly sustainable? How much can the resources on our planet take? We have to remember as well that the highest population growth is in the countries that can least sustain it, where a lot of water supplies, for example, are already scarce?
I mean, I would not disagree that population growth is a cause of pressure on the planet, and I would agree with what Population Matters would say on that. But I think, for Oxfam, and I think at this moment at the COP going on in Egypt, we want to be very, very careful that this debate doesn't distract from focusing on the insane levels of consumption of the very richest on the planet, because it becomes a debate about contraception for women in Africa right at the moment when we need to be pointing out that billionaires are emitting 1 million times more carbon than the average person, and that the top 1%, just the top 1% of humanity, have twice as many carbon emissions as the whole of the bottom 50%. So I think it's very much about both. But I think for me, what worries me is that we rapidly shift to talking about the situation with poor people in poor countries and letting rich people off the hook once again.
Well, tell us in the meantime, I mean, which other species will we be actually pushing out of the way to make room for us? And is that acceptable?
It's a strange question. I'm not David Attenborough, but I mean, obviously the pressure on the natural world is enormous, but I think it also can be managed. I think it's, I mean, I've lived and worked in many countries in Africa, and I've seen the impact of significant population growth. I mean, Malawi, when I first lived in Malawi in the year 2000, there were about 9 million people. There are now 18 million people. And that has an impact, particularly, for instance, on forestry. So the number of trees has virtually disappeared the last time I visited the country. So I do think overpopulation has a big impact on the natural world. But I also do think it can be managed. If those people had access to cheap and effective energy, then they wouldn't need the firewood. They wouldn't be cutting down the trees. So I think there are ways that I don't think technology is the absolutely, fix for everything, but I do think in some ways slightly more wealth and income for those at the bottom actually reduces the impact on the environment, particularly on issues like forestry and the natural world. So I think it will have an impact on other species. I think it is a major issue to see 10 billion people on the planet. But I do think that right now, as businesses and private jets are flying into the COP in Egypt, we should be focusing on the much, much bigger damage being done to our world by the richest people.
I mean, Robin, you're not David Attenborough either, but we know we're pushing species off the planet. Go ahead.
So David Attenborough is our patron, so I'm delighted to speak on his behalf, if you like. I mean, he has put it very simply. All environmental problems become harder with ever more people and easier with fewer people. And that's a very simplistic statement. And Max, thank you for pointing out the impact on other species than ourselves. We've just had the Living Planet report from Worldwide Fund for Nature and the Zoological Society of London. They recorded a 70% loss, as they put it, of all wildlife populations on Earth. The last time they produced the report was 2 years ago. It was 68%. And about 20 years ago, when they first produced it, it was 30%. So we're having a massive impact. And of course, why have we got COP27 going on in Sharm el Sheikh? Because of climate change, which is accelerating. And it is a tragedy that population is one of the key drivers of accelerating climate change. You're absolutely right, Max. I have no brief for the 1% plutocrats flying around the world in Lear jets and consuming Egyptian pharaohs. Are absolutely deplorable. But the tragedy is that actually the 10% includes you and I, because I've seen the Oxfam stats. The income is $38,000. I mean, the average income in the UK is about £28,000. That's $42,000. So we are all consuming far too much, and we need to reduce our consumption. But at the same time, we need to enable, so it's our responsibility here in the rich developed world, as you've rightly said, who've produced the majority of the pollution to date.
Right.
But it's also our responsibility to enable choice by the hundreds of millions of women and girls who don't have that in low to middle income countries. And they want it. They want it. I've been in Nigeria. I've been in Kenya, just like you. I know people from Malawi. And my colleagues in Africa and in India and across Southeast Asia, they want choice. And if you look at some of the countries where that's been enabled, like Costa Rica, they've provided what people want. They've reduced birth rates. They've restored their forest. And they are now seen as the happiest country in the world, according to the happiness index. 60 years ago, their birth rate was 3.8%. Their GDP was $380. Now it's 12,000. Their forests, 70% have been cut back. Now it's 50% regenerated. So you can see where you can do really positive things.
Yeah. Robin, let me ask you, while we lost your connection for a second. So I had mentioned that, some of the poorest countries actually, where resources like water, for example, are already strained, they're expected to see some of the greatest population growth going forward. So let me ask you what that will mean for the wider globe. Are we talking about more migration here? Because we're not likely going to get these problems fixed in time. And we know wealthy countries don't necessarily want to adapt their immigration policies. They would prefer to continue to reject people from the developing world.
Of course, that's a worry. I mean, the primary worry is what it means for those people in those countries. And you started with a quote from Malala. And one of the things I think is really brilliant that the Malala Fund has been doing is saying, well, if you educate girls, if you enable them access to family planning, it means they're going to be much more resilient in the face of climate change impacts. They can take action. They are educated to be proactive in their communities. They know what weather reports mean. And the Malala Fund's research shows that where girls are educated, where family planning is available, actually deaths from climate change impacts are lower. But you're right about potentials of migration. If you look at the Sahel, that part of North Africa, where not only is population growing, doubling, tripling over the next 20 to 50 years, so are climate change temperatures. It's not sort of 1 to 2 degrees, it's 3 to 5, 6 to 8. Now, where will those people go in an uninhabitable landscape, north or south? We will see more right-wing, nationalistic, particularly nasty governments across southern Europe putting up walls like Mr. Trump. And we will see countries south in sub-Saharan Africa finding challenges too. So it's our responsibility to provide the aid to reduce our climate emissions and to enable those people to adapt and mitigate climate change.
Well, let's see if that happens. It hasn't gone very well so far. But Max, let me come back to you, because you had said about, the top tiers of society, the wealthiest of the wealthiest, are the ones that are emitting the most carbon into the atmosphere, effectively doing the most damage. But on a micro level, and you were talking about some of the areas you worked in Africa, people born, for example, into kind of poverty-stricken areas are still consumers on that level that will use plastics and fuels that tend to very severely degrade their immediate locations. As you said, there's the forest land that's being lost for firewood and stuff. Is this being addressed? Because it is devastating when you do see it at the ground level.
Yeah, I think the most important thing to note is that in order to get beyond that, you have to be less poor to a certain extent. Your country has to be better off. If you want to shift primarily, for instance, from firewood, which most of the people in Malawi use to cook, to other sources of energy and fuel that do less harm to the environment, then that involves Malawi getting richer as a country. And you can see that happening in other places. And I think the Costa Rica example is a good one. I suppose I'm just really worried that, all of this focuses our attention in the wrong place at this key moment in history, because it becomes about, the impact that the poorest people in the world are having on the planet, when right now the planet is being destroyed by the richest. And I think it is true that everyone in Europe has a consumption story, but the super rich are on another level. And we released new figures in the last 2 weeks looking at the investment emissions of the richest people. So not just their private jets and their cars, but where they're putting their money. The world's billionaires are twice as likely to be invested in polluting industries like energy, coal, or gas, or indeed cement. These kinds of polluters, this polluting elite, are destroying our planet. It is not the fault of the poorest people. And I think it's really, really important that we keep focused on this at that moment.
But that's so binary, Max, isn't it? You're making a choice between the plutocrats or the poorest, and it's not as simple as that. It's far more complex. I mean, in your Oxfam study, that top 10%, it includes people like you and me. We are major polluters too, because we're earning. I'm sure you're earning over over $38,000 at Oxfam for your salary. So you are a high-level consumer. And as the world rightly develops, people want to consume more. And we're seeing, the highest growth in consumption and consumers is in the former fastest population growth areas of India and China. Those people are rightly wanting to use more. And here I'm wearing my SDGs badge because I believe in it. But we are not going to achieve those sustainable development goals at the current rate of development.
Okay.
And the tragedy is what you're going to see is to do that, people will need to use a lot more energy, and that will accelerate climate change. So I don't think it can be either or. Hit the plutocrats by all means, but we have to reduce our consumption. We have to enable others to manage the population as they want.
Sorry, I'm going to have to interrupt it there. I'd like to thank you and Max really so much for being with us on this edition of The Newsmakers. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have. Thanks to our viewers, of course, as well. Remember, you can follow us on Twitter at @the_newsmakers, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey, and we'll see you next time.